There were 15 starships in the entire human universe. That's all. 15. Most people don't understand why we simply can't build more. They don't understand how they're built, how rare the correct conditions are. All 15 starships were manufactured by massive robotic processing ships. Humanity built 50 or so over the course of a century. These massive ships, roughly spherical and about 3 kilometers in diameter, had one job. During their decades-long life, they cruised the solar system, seeking certain metallic asteroids. These they would harvest, processing the metals, always looking for the elements required for the very specific job of manufacturing the hull of a starship. These giant ships were costly enough to bankrupt entire nations, with no guarantee of success, but the gamble was worth it if a usable starship hull could be made. The owners of starships gained access to the most valuable thing in the universe, planets suitable for colonies. The value of an entire planet made the expense and risk of building a processing ship tiny by comparison. Starship hulls were made of a chromium, nickel, and cobalt alloy that by itself was the toughest metal known to humans. But the real magic lay in how it was processed. In the vast coldness of space, the massive factory ships smelted and purified the materials, eventually acquiring enough to create a hull. Then the final melt was started. In the core of the ship, fusion-powered furnaces 50 meters across flared to temperatures of thousands of degrees. Each metal added in equal measure to the massive crucible in the center of the ship, where the concentrated heat made the mass glow like a small sun. Once the final purification was completed, the molten alloy was pumped through heated lines to a ring-like structure a few hundred meters across. It started small and grew, looking for all the world like a soap bubble at first. Then, as the molten alloy was blown slowly outwards, incredibly thin, it began to form a cylinder, rounded at one end. Slowly the process continued. Even tiny variations could result in failure, for a hull must be perfect. Eventually, the extrusion was completed, resulting in a shimmering kilometer or so long cigar-shaped tube, pointed at one end almost like a needle, and rounded and globular at the other. As the hull was extruded, it cooled in frozen space almost instantly, so fast that no crystals could form in its structure. The resultant metal was called an amorphous alloy, a single metal structure with no crystals, grains, or any imperfections in it. This one attribute meant that the hull was the strongest construct in the known universe. A starship hull was nearly indestructible, and it had to be, to withstand the stresses of interstellar travel. It was also a beautiful, almost delicate structure. As each hull was formed in a unique area of space, under extreme conditions, the surface of their hulls acquired a vibrant color. These metallic hues were uniform on each hull and as unique as any fingerprint. The colors were the basis for the ship's names: the Crimson Dart, a blood-red hull, Golden Arrow, the Eternal Flame, a yellow-hued ship, and the Emerald Spire, all named for their colors so intense that in the sunlit vacuum of space, these ships seemed almost alive. Artists had made studies of their colors a life's work and still failed to capture the raw beauty. Hull penetrations had to be formed by implements along the ring. As the hull was being extruded, the tools performed a pre-programmed pattern while it was still semi-molten. These perforations enabled the engineers to fit the necessary machinery and structures to the finished hull blank, since machining or even drilling a hole in one was impossible. Someone once tried to use a shard of hull metal as a drill point to penetrate a hull. They simply succeeded in burning out several very large, expensive drilling systems. Eventually, they tried brute force, massive pressures, and very high speeds. The shard shattered. The resulting explosion destroyed the equipment, a good part of the assembly station, and killed an operator. There wasn't even a scratch detectable with the naked eye on the hull. That, they decided, was enough of that. When the processing ship completed its function, it was expended. The crucibles and lines were now plugged with the residues of solid metal impossible to remove. The entire operation, success or failure, was a one-time event in the life of the ship. The AI that ran the ship executed a series of tests and scans of the new still-cooling hull. Only on occasion was there a defective hull created. The AI responsible became so despondent it hurled itself and the hull into the sun before anyone could get to it to salvage what they could. Once the AI on board had determined the hull had been successfully created, it had one last duty to perform. It fired up a massive transmitter array and sent out a repeating signal, which was the name of the ship, the owning company, the location, and whether or not the completed hull was usable. It would repeat this until the isotopes in its primary reactor decayed below the point they could produce enough power to run the transmitter. Back near Earth, entire nations had listened for these signals. Once received, the race was on to get to the hull first and claim this priceless prize. In theory, the companies or nations that had built the processing ships owned the resulting hulls. In practice, the decades-long searching often meant that the people who built it were dead, the companies defunct, or the nations under new regimes. This meant that possession of the hull nearly ensured ownership. There had been legal cases, murder, and warfare over several of the hulls. Such was their value that destruction of a space station with hundreds aboard had seemed a small price to pay for access to the stars. The last signal had been heard over 85 years ago. Experts and others had theorized that there were insufficient remnants of the critical alloys left in the solar system, or that the ships had aged and broke down before completing their missions. A few dreamers still listened, but like those who searched for Atlantis of old, they were often the butt of impolite jokes. Everyone figured the last of the processing ships were cold, floating hulks, or broken bits of metal drifting for eternity amongst the asteroids they had so patiently and futilely searched until they died. No one took on the great cost of building more processing ships, assuming there would never be a return for the soul-crushing debt incurred. We had what we had, and that was it. Almost 100 years after its launch from a long-gone orbital station, built by a company that existed as an legal entity almost entirely forgotten, a processing ship orbited far, far out beyond the orbit of the outer planets. Its mind of artificial intelligence having found nothing useful inside the orbit of Jupiter, it had done something unexpected. 40 years after its launch, it had queried all of the other remaining processing ships it could find about the presence of the materials they all needed. Some refused to answer, being programmed that the information was proprietary. Others shared their results. None had found what they needed. The AI thought about this. It considered its directive, locate materials. There were no boundaries on where to search. The requirement to complete the job as quickly as possible had been a failure, but there was no limitations on duration. After processing its options, it decided, long dormant drive systems ignited, and the ship headed outward. Ponderously past Jupiter, the great rings of Saturn, past the orbits of the outer planets, past even the heliopause, where even the sun's influence ended, into the Oort cloud. The Oort cloud is the remnants of the formation of the solar system billions of years ago. Similar to the asteroid belt, it contains many smaller bodies. Occasionally, one of these would be disturbed by a passing star or some other anomaly and fall towards the sun, forming a comet. It was very far away. It would take decades to get there, so no one had thought to have processing ships head out that far. The ship finally completed the journey and began its long search. This time it found what it needed. Small bits here and there, it took even more decades, but at last it had enough. It started its final operation. Giant fusion-powered furnaces came to life. Long dormant machines quickened. Several systems failed due to age and decay, but the AI compensated. It was creating its magnum opus after almost a century of work. It would not allow something like minor systems failures, or even major ones, to stop it now. The hull took shape, its lonely berth attended only by a single mind, whose focus was on completing his long-awaited task and silent stars in eternal darkness. The hull was nearly finished. The AI ran the required test sequences. It passed. The AI reviewed an image of the hull it had just completed, the culmination of its life's purpose. This hull was a brilliant metallic blue, glistening in the starlight. Whether because of the location it was forged in, out beyond the protection of Earth's sun, with the vast bombardment of cosmic rays, or some minor elements left in the alloying process from the system's malfunctions, the AI didn't know. While the hull met the specifications and was perfect, it was blue. No other hulls had been any shade of blue. The engineering logic determined that color was irrelevant and handed the task to its aesthetic subroutine. The AI pondered as it regarded the cooling hull, and it made its last independent decision. An arm extended out and scribed the ship's name near the tip of the spire. Azure Flame. It tucked away the tools and began the shutdown process. All energy was channeled to the transmitter. Massive fusion furnaces slowly cooled to near absolute zero, and darkness once again became the norm. Its one high-gain antenna was pointed towards the sun. It lacked any better means of aiming its signal, as its designers had never conceived of it being so far out. They had not seen need for the accuracy to hit a tiny blue speck over 200 billion kilometers away. The signal would take just over 9 days to reach the inner solar system, where hopefully someone would hear it, if anyone was listening, if it was strong enough to be heard. These problems were outside of the AI's parameters, so with the digital version of a shrug, it formatted the message, checked it, and began transmitting. With that, its life work was complete. It prepared to shut down. It left a tiny part of itself alive, just enough to run the beacon for another 50 years or so, finally going to sleep forever in the coldness of deep space, its last words repeating into the lonely darkness. Celestron processor sends, Azure Flame. Completed location, Sol 1578.2259, AU inclination 33.738, declination 179.224, orbital vectors 225.79 by 3759.25. End Part 1.